Well, my name's Jean Haggerty, and my maiden name was McElhenney. I was the oldest sister of Kevin McElhenney, who died on Bloody Sunday. I actually lived in Canada at the time of Bloody Sunday, although I travelled home for my brother's funeral, and then I would have been home on holidays and all that kind of stuff. But I returned from Canada at about 1995, 96, and I knew that there was a campaign happening, and mostly because actually I didn't know a lot of facts about my brother's death. I suppose the involvement grew from that. I attended meetings of the Bloody Sunday Justice Campaign from quite a selfish perspective, that I wanted to learn about Bloody Sunday, because when I got back from Canada, and you would ask, if you ask somebody about Bloody Sunday, you've got nearly like a stock answer. I used to want to scream at people. Sure, everybody knows about Bloody Sunday. I didn't live here. I didn't know about Bloody Sunday. So, lots of things in terms of Kevin's death. Physically, I never knew where the wound was. Geographically, I didn't know where Kevin died. I suppose, I dare say I could or should have, or maybe even did, talk to my parents, but when I would have come home on holiday, my parents didn't talk about Kevin.
My name's Tony Doherty. Born and bred in Derry. Spent most of my life in Derry. My primary connection to the Museum of Free Derry stems from the fact that my father was executed on Bloody Sunday. So I have grown up in a conflict situation, both in a personal capacity, but also in a communal capacity. Have always been aware, from a young enough age, that there have been two narratives to the history of the state and the history of the conflict, and obviously one is pro-state and the other is anti-state. Since Bloody Sunday is always very conscious of the propaganda war, as it were, and the fact that the British government, they were able to besmirch the names and lives of those that were murdered on the day, and to elevate their own forces as heroes.
Are you quite sure that nothing was fired at them first?
There was nothing fired at them, sir. I'm absolutely certain of that. I can speak of this without any difficulty whatsoever, because I was there. I was just standing at the flats when the Saracens moved in, first of all, and there was nothing fired at them. Positively nothing fired at them whatsoever. There weren't even stones fired. And people ran in all directions and they opened fire. Most people had their backs to them when they opened fire at the time.
Are you saying that the Paras only opened fire because they were fired on first? Because the people in the bog side are saying that no shots were fired at the troops as they came in?
Most certainly. There's absolutely no doubt at all.
When events started, when the rioting started and that, and I was hearing that in Canada, I suppose I'm going to have to say I believed what I was hearing in the press. I had no reason not to. Communication at that time with my parents would have been a phone call a couple of times a year. There wouldn't have been constant communication, not like now. And it was really, the Bloody Sunday Inquiry for me was like every day I learned something new about the Troubles.
My name is Adrian Karen. I'm the curator of the Museum of Free Derry. I've been involved in this project now for the last 18 years. My day-to-day role in here, curator in a small museum, has probably a wider role than curators in larger museums where they have a whole team of people. My job would be looking after the collection, looking after the exhibition, general museum management on a day-to-day basis, making sure we're up and running. And I suppose for a large part of the last 18 years, my job was to develop the museum from the idea stage through the previous museum that we had on this site through into the building that we have now. So I've concentrated a lot over the years on the physical development of the museum as well as the sort of internal.
Well, my name is Robin Percival. I'm originally from England. I come from a town called Widnes near Liverpool. I've lived in Derry now for over 40 years. And I've been involved really right from the beginning in the campaign around Bloody Sunday and in the establishment of the Bloody Sunday Trust, and then the creation of the Museum of Free Derry. Well, I suppose the story in a way starts with the creation of the Bloody Sunday Trust, which provided some services to families who'd lost loved ones in Bloody Sunday. And as the inquiry was set up, what we now know as the Saville Inquiry was set up, some thought was given to what the trust could do in the long term, and that was where the idea of a museum first came.
Bloody Sunday Trust is an organisation that was set up to support the families, initially through the latter stages of the Bloody Sunday Justice campaign, and then the very elongated process of the Bloody Sunday Inquiry. When the trust was set up, they had a sort of second idea, which was to preserve the history of the era that created Bloody Sunday. And you can't understand Bloody Sunday properly just looking at a day. You have to look at the historical process. And I suppose the obvious idea when you decide to preserve a period of history is also how you could present that period of history. So the idea was there to create a space.
So the idea of the trust was to try and widen the civic involvement in the issue of Bloody Sunday. And one of the purposes that the trust was set up to do was to establish what we called at that stage the Bogside History Centre.
That was an idea that was put forward by Colin Barton, and it developed into the idea of a Museum of Free Derry. And so that's really how it started. It really was the first, what might one call, major project of the trust after the beginning of the Saville Inquiry.
My name is John Kelly. I am the Education Outreach Officer here, employed by the Bloody Sunday Trust. I was employed as a family liaison worker with the Bloody Sunday Trust during the inquiry, the Saville Inquiry, the Bloody Sunday Inquiry. And we're actually based in over there on Chippy Street, in the old bank at the bottom of Chippy Street. And the trust set it up as a base for the families, more or less. And within the building, we had a place for the families. We had counselling services and support services for the families and for witnesses. And then upstairs were solicitors, Madden Finucane solicitors were there. And I was employed at the time by the trust, along with another family member, Mickey McKinney, as family liaison workers. In other words, what we were the conduit between the families and the outside world. And we were employed during the full length of the inquiry.
The Saville Inquiry really changed the official version of what had taken place on Bloody Sunday. Most people who are watching this will be aware that it was set up by the Blair government to look into the events of Bloody Sunday. It interrogated, questioned, took evidence from hundreds of people, mainly people who were on the march itself in January 1972, but it also included people such as the soldiers, the shooters, policemen, journalists, and so on and so forth. It rejected really the Widgery Tribunal, which blamed the marchers, the Civil Rights Association, and basically exonerated the British Army. Saville reversed that and basically argued that it was caused by the activities of the British Army, where I think most people feel that the report let us down was in terms of who within the army structure Saville blamed. I mean, Saville blamed the shooters, obviously, and to some extent he also criticised the commander of the paratroopers, Lieutenant Colonel Wilford, but he exonerated people higher up, which I don't think he should have done, because the choice of the parachute regiment was a critical choice, and had there been another regiment, it's unlikely that there would have been a Bloody Sunday. And the parachute regiment also had form, we know that from Ballymurphy, And Saville refused to look at the events leading up to Bloody Sunday in terms of the activities of the parachute regiment, which I think is a significant failing in the report. But that's, he gave his report. It was widely welcomed because it exonerated the people who were killed, and also because it blamed the British Army, and it formed the basis on which David Cameron subsequently made his apology in Parliament.
So we're actually in that building for 7 years, and part of the building was also set aside as an exhibition on Bloody Sunday, and was made up simply of maybe about 12 large photographs, a selection of photographs of the families, a TV screen, and a soundtrack. That's all it was. So that went on for 7 years within that building until we had to close it down and move on. And more or less, the idea of a museum actually stemmed from the exhibition and that building. So up until that point, I was a family liaison worker. And then they decided to set up the museum. And I was then employed as the education officer within the museum, and I've been here ever since.
We were always trying to sort of find an opportunity in terms of where, how, when, and by what means financially we could establish the museum. And I think it was 2004. The housing executive put an ad under the plan permission section of the Derry Journal to demolish a row of flats on this spot in Glenfada Park, and that row of flats had the original bullet holes in the wall from Bloody Sunday, fired probably by Soldier F. And I saw it and immediately felt that would be an opportunity for us to actually do something on the location.
Some people would argue maybe we should be in a nice city centre site, but it was really important for us to be in the bog site where this history happened, where the story that we're telling comes from.
And you couldn't put this place anywhere else. Bloody Sunday happened just outside the door. And lots of people come in here and they don't realise that. You have to point it out to them. Hey, look, there's so many died in the care park, there's so many, so their eyes pop. This is what it's all about. They tell that story.
I suppose because it wasn't a museum in its early days, it was like a drop-in centre, and we decided to put posters up and a couple of storyboards. So it kind of evolved. You didn't kind of think of it as working in a museum. And all of this was during the period of the inquiry, so the Bloody Sunday families could drop in and people walked in off the street, and it developed slowly. So, the idea of working in a museum that was telling the story essentially of your brother's death, it kind of eased into it, sort of thing. So it didn't seem, oh God, I'm going to have a story talking about Kevin. It kind of evolved.
So when we set it up, we were more or less raw, if you want to call it that. And I would have went inside the museum, walked around, interacted with them. In normal museums, you don't get that. In a normal museum, you walk in and you walk around at your own pace. And you read your own stuff, the stuff that you want to, and look at the stuff that you want to look at. Or we were different, and we still are different. We are prepared to talk to people, explain what happened, explain that we were part of the story. And as there was one day I was talking to a girl from the BBC, and I said, I'm like a walking artefact, because I was there on Bloody Sunday. My young brother was murdered on Bloody Sunday, so I can talk about that. But by me introducing myself as I am the brother of one of the victims of Bloody Sunday, and that really opens up the conversation between people. And this is what it's all about. Well, many people have said to me in the past, this is my counsel, that because I'm able to talk about it on a daily basis, and we'll talk about Michael, I was there on Bloody Sunday. I witnessed Bloody Sunday. I was part of it. It's been part of my life for the last for 2/3 of my life. It's been part of that. Never left it since that day. I'm always part of it, if you want to call it that. And to me, actually talking about it on a daily basis, people say to me, that is your outlet. I don't look at it that way. I see it in such a way that I am speaking on behalf of Michael and on behalf of all those who died that day, to ensure that people understand the story. I can tell my story. I could tell people exactly what happened to me that day. But I can also talk about Michael and what happened to him. I can also talk about my family, what happened in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday, how it affected my family. But all family members can do the exact same thing. But I am in a position here, I can tell people and let them know exactly what happened. What happened to Michael, what happened to the family, and what happened to me. By doing so, people say, that's your outlet. But let me tell you something. The way I work it here is, I come in here, say at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I leave here, if I can, at 4:30, sometimes 5:30, sometimes 5 o'clock. But when I walk out that door again, it's left there. Because otherwise, it would take over my life completely. And I don't want that to happen. I have a family, my own family. I have my own life. But when I'm in here, I talk about and ensure that people understand the story of exactly what happened. This is the way I operate. And that's the only way I can operate. Otherwise, I would go nuts. And you can't allow that to happen.
There was some attempts right at the very first to try and make it a museum that if you like, told both sides of the story or everybody's story. And we resisted that, and it wasn't a difficult struggle. I mean, it wasn't, it wasn't a showdown. People eventually accepted that the museum was going to tell a particular story and tell it in a particular way. So while initially there was some pressure from what one might call the museum establishment in Northern Ireland to make it a bit like the Ulster Museum, that pressure was resisted. And I think now looking back, the people who probably wished initially that we were more like the Ulster Museum now accept that it's actually better because we're not.
We have very, very diverse perceptions of history in the North, and that's something that's always created conflict. The only way to sort of resolve that is to first off acknowledge the different perceptions of history and then understand them. And that to me is one of the most important things in this museum, is that it's telling a history that we don't expect everyone to agree with. We just expect them to accept that this is our view on history, this is what happened. I'd love to see other museums like this where we can go and understand other stories as well and get to the point where, the difference in perceptions of history is something that we can discuss, something that's an issue for discussion rather than division.
I mean, there's room for more people telling stories about what happened, obviously, and we don't claim to tell the whole story, and of course we're limited to a very definite time frame, 68 to 72. So there's room for a lot more, but I think that what you need to hear and what everybody needs to hear is that in fact this museum reflects what we wanted it to be.
That's the importance of independence. You do what you have to do and ensure that it is the truth.
When we started towards this museum, it really was a subject for many not to be talked about. It was a part of the conflict. There have always been some who want to just push that whole thing under the carpet and forget about it, and draw a line in the sand and move on. The British government at the moment are making very strong moves towards that, with their end of all legacy investigations, and that's basically to cover their own role within it. But we can't move on from this history until we resolve it. This is what happened within the North. We have to acknowledge it. We have to look at the wounds that were created, and we have to do what we can to resolve this history. It can't be just a matter of sweep it under the carpet and move on.
Well, the way it works is quite simple. We're here to tell the story between from the early days of the civil rights era, say from 1968, right through the Battle of the Bogside and Free Derry, right through Bloody Sunday, internment, the lot. Internment is imprisonment without trial. So there were hundreds of nationalists who were arrested and put in jail, never brought before the courts, never prosecuted. It was just a method of taking people off the streets. So that was in August 1971. And at the time of Bloody Sunday, we still had internment. So that's what Bloody Sunday was all about. It was a peaceful protest against internment. And Bloody Sunday happened. The war got worse. So the British decided that Free Derry could not last any longer. So they wanted to break down the barricades. So Motorman was introduced in July 1972, 6 months after Bloody, 29th of July, I think it was just after Bloody, 6 months directly after Bloody Sunday, whereby the British government sent in 21,000 troops, British troops, into the north to break down the barricades. And we had even chieftain tanks in these streets. And we had the loss of 2 innocent people that day, young Seamus Bradley and Daniel Higgerty. A 16-year-old boy and an 18-year-old were murdered by the British Army that morning. So that morning, and I remembered well, I was living in the Bogside over by the top of Stanley's Walk. That morning it happened, and I can still hear the sirens, the sirens going off, and that was the warning to the people, apart from the Bunlads too as well. And I got up that morning and went out, and I couldn't believe what I seen. The amount of British soldiers lined right along the street where I was living. Unbelievable. And they came in that morning and they broke down the barricades and opened the place up to the world, if you want to call it that. And things changed forever after that. Because the place was never the same as far as I was concerned. Because now we have British soldiers on the streets, can do what they want and did what they want over from there on afterwards. Whereas within the Free Derry, it was controlled by the people. Our barricades went down, IRA went into the background, then the war was ongoing from then. That year alone, 1972, nearly 500 people lost their lives here in the north because of what happened here on Bloody Sunday, because the war was escalated directly after Bloody Sunday, and because of Motorman. Many things attached to it, that created the real monster of the war.
My name's Hannah Brown. I am a museum guide and I'm also currently studying my Masters part-time in history. My first kind of experience with history was my granddad Charlie. He was a big inspiration to me. He adored history. He read books constantly and just shared loads of stories with myself and my twin sister, so I could not be interested in history. My day-to-day role would be show people around, kind of down the stairs. I would give them a brief introduction, tell them a bit of background on the museum, so when it was established and kind of who works in here, so about Jean and John and their kind of role in the museum, and then I would give them just kind of a brief overview of the museum itself, so kind of what will be covered whenever they're walking around and kind of examples of things that they would see. So we have 2 jackets in our collection and I like to bring those up. One was worn by Jim Ray and the other one was worn by Michael McDade. They both still have visible bullet holes in it, and I think whenever you say that there to people, they realise, all right, that's truly what's in here. It's people's clothing, it's not just writing on walls, it's actual artefacts that belong to people. These are people's items, these are what they wore on a day, like me or you going and putting on clothes in the morning just to go out somewhere. It's their own personal items. So I would explain that there to people, kind of tell them to brace themselves, I suppose, is I think what I mostly do, because it's so emotional in here. You need to be told what you're walking into.
Well, first of all, you have the jacket belong to Michael McDade. Michael McDade is actually in this photograph. And what is happening here is my brother Michael is actually lying on the ground after being shot. He was the first to be shot at the barricade by Soldier F. And Michael's walking into the photographs totally unconcerned, not realising or knowing what actually happened to Michael. I'm lying on the ground. Within a minute he's shot. And he was shot in the left cheek, and the bullet actually came out through his back, the right hand side of his back, so it actually travelled down through him. What we have here is 108 empty shells. They're not the actual shells from the day itself, but these are the amount of bullets that the army, that the MOD said that the British Army fired that day. So as a guy came in one day and he offered these shells, they more or less to demonstrate what was actually, the amount was actually fired officially by the British Army that day. But being one of the people who was there on Bloody Sunday, I can tell you there was more than 108 shots fired. But it's important to lay out and give the significance of the amount of bullets were fired on the day itself. We have two letters here. One is from a captain within the parachute regiment and to his men telling them that they're due leave and so on. In other words, what he's saying is, forget about Bloody Sunday, forget about it, it's totally insignificant, and just get on with what we're doing. But the other one is the most important one to me, is a letter from a loyalist in Loughall, I think it was, to the Ray family. One of these totally hateful letters describing Jim as, I don't want to, you can say it yourself, but the fact of the matter is that that type of letter went to all the families. My mother and father got them. And actually, they came on the anniversaries as well after for many, many, many years. So the people out there, bad, sick people, were sending that type of letter to the families to annoy them.
And the families couldn't get any support from councils or governments or anything to do with that there?
Absolutely not, absolutely not. The families were left to their own devices. There was no support at all for them in any way whatsoever. They just had to get on with life, and more or less were told that, just get on with it, And even within the aftermath, where my family, I can talk about my family. My mother, for 5 years, remembered nothing after Bloody Sunday, because she mentally, her mind went, and she had to be looked after by some of my older sisters. Come back and move back into the house. They were married and had to move back into the house and look after her and the younger children. Like, I come from a big family. I had 12. There were 12 of us plus my mother and father. Some of us were married, but some were still in the house. So, and mentally and physically, she wasn't capable of looking after herself. So there was no support at all, absolutely none. And she ended up in Derry. They call it Grantia in Derry, for a period of time too as well. But thank God she was revived and came back again. And she was there, believe it or not, she was there to the start of the second inquiry into Bloody Sunday. But she never seen the end of it, This jacket is Jim Ray's. Jim Ray was outside there, and he's actually photographed there at the front. And Jim was out there, and believe it or not, he's actually in one of the photographs where my brother Michael was being carried prior to him being shot, Jim being shot. So there's actually 2 bullet holes in the jacket, and there's an exit through the shoulder too as well. What happened to Jim was he was outside, and as he ran away, he was shot in the back. And as he lay on the ground, a soldier, we believe was Soldier G, came walking past Jim. Seen he was still alive and put a second bullet into his back. So that's Jim's jacket. And you can see the brutality of it, 2 bullet holes and the size of the exit, which these bullets created on the day itself. So it's really about the civil rights movement. It's about internment. It's about the fight that the people endured during the Battle of the Bogside. And it's very, very important to tell that story, because this is the People's Museum and this is the people's story. That's what we tell.
The word healing is often comes to the fore in many of the conversations that we have. The last thing we want to do is re-traumatise people, least of all the families. But the museum has been built, I suppose, on people's history, on the fact that people have their own sort of memories and their own artefacts that belong to their loved ones who were killed on Bloody Sunday and on other occasions during Free Derry. So we feel that the existence of the museum itself has a healing purpose, but it's also about finding out and providing the narrative of this community, which is now accepted across the world. The Bloody Sunday story is accepted by and large by the British government as a result of the Saville Inquiry. So those are all big things in my book to be acknowledged, to be celebrated, and to actually teach and instruct our people.
That was one of the things we ensured, that the younger generations, especially children, can come in here without any fear of being upset.
You know, we've had to give a lot of thought to what sort of artefacts we use, what sort of images we use. We are putting across a very violent story, but we have to be careful that we're not being in any way sensationalist. We're definitely not out to shock. We have to think of the audiences we have, which can include young children and stuff like that. We have to think of the people involved. You know, if we're using sort of very violent imagery in here and somebody comes in who has been personally affected by that, we don't want to be re-traumatising anyone or anything. So there is a balance to get between telling the story the way it needs to be told and not causing any further hurt in how we tell the story. We have not set out in any way to use this story to try and make people angry or anything like that. Personally, I would prefer if the emotion people felt when leaving this museum, I would much prefer it if that was determination that it would never happen again. Not any sort of an anger to go out and seek revenge or anything like that. That is not what it's about. You know, it's about resolving these issues, not about stirring up new ones.
We have the likes of banners from way back in 1968. We have rubber bullet guns. We have bin lids. It was an elaborate, high-tech method of warning people that the British Army was invading the areas. And it was mostly the women came out. Once one bin lid went off, there were hundreds went off, you know. So once they came into the area, the women came out straight away, boom, 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 banging on the ground. You couldn't mistake it. On Bloody Sunday, we have the bloodstained banner. We have artefacts belonging to every one of the victims who died on Bloody Sunday. For instance, my brother, Michael, there's an artefact there which is the bloodstained baby grove. And there's a story behind the baby grove and why it's in there, but not only just the baby grove, but all of them, all the artefacts, there is a story behind every one of them. So there's nothing harrowing to see. This is not to create nightmares. It's not a museum that's there to upset people. We try not to upset people, but we have seen lots of emotion from people when they come in here. I've seen at times people coming in less than 2 minutes. Even the soundtrack in the background, they can't take it. I've seen people come in here and they stay hours.
I think the museum's important for a number of reasons. First of all, I think the story of Free Derry is an incredible story. It resonates across the world. I mean, the Free Derry Wall, for example, is an iconic structure which is well known throughout the world, particularly by people who are interested in promoting civil rights and in campaigning for social justice.
Free Derry, to me, if you go back to the old days when Free Derry was set up, it meant freedom for the people. Freedom to control their own lives. Freedom to have their right to what any human being is entitled to. So Free Derry, in the context of a Free Derry, when people will look at it's that they cut themselves out away from the British establishment and set up their own area without control by the British government. That was initially at the beginning when people decided, hey, that's enough. We're doing our own thing here. But that's not the way it was. People had lives. Even during Free Derry, I still had to travel to work. And I worked on the water side, so I had to go over through British Army patrols and everything, get the water side, and then come back again after work into Free Derry. It was a different type of place, if you understand what I mean. But the people loved it. I remember after Motorman, when they broke down the barricades, I could have cried that day, simply because I realised that people, the British Army and the police could come and go as they pleased then within their area and do what they wanted. Whereas when Free Derry was set up, we were in control.
The Free Derry experience is an experience which a lot of people look to for inspiration. I mean, I had one experience, for example. I went with John Kelly a few years ago. Must have been 2016. I went to America, to Little Rock in Arkansas. And Little Rock had been the site of a famous struggle to integrate the schools, to allow black children to go to the same schools as white children. And this particular struggle had taken place in the 1950s and had led to American troops being introduced into the state of Arkansas by the then President Eisenhower. What really surprised me, perhaps it shouldn't have done, but what really did surprise me when we got there was just how many people, particularly in the African American community, looked to what had happened in Ireland as a source of inspiration, even though we know that the inspiration for the civil rights struggle in Ireland actually came from America, because obviously Martin Luther King and the other events that we associate with civil rights predate what happened in Derry. But nevertheless, what happened in Derry and the struggle for civil rights here resonates with a lot of people in America, in South Africa and elsewhere. So I think it's important we have a place which tells the story of what actually happened during the Free Derry period. And this is what the museum attempts to do. And I think the visitor numbers show that it's a story that still resonates with an enormous number of people from throughout the world.
We very proactively engaged other campaign groups throughout the island, actually, and in Britain. Like the Hillsborough families that were lost in 1989, such tragic circumstances, and the Loughlin Island families, the Ballymurphy families, the Stardust families in Dublin have been up here on quite a number of occasions.
We get all nationalities from all over the world. We get them from everywhere. And when they come out, we actually, at times we say, what do you think? Harrowing, they would say, or that's fantastic, or no, different viewpoints. I really enjoyed it, as you know, it's the one that most people say, but they turn around and say, no, I didn't mean it that way. You know, this is the way it works with people. And when people come out that way, we know it's worked.
We noticed ourselves during years of conflict how important solidarity is. One of the most emotional things I've ever seen in my life was on the evening of the 15th of June 2010, the night the Saville report was released. And I was sent a link to a video of a town in Palestine having a public meeting about Bloody Sunday that night, and to see Palestinian people who have suffered so much getting together holding photographs of the 14 victims of Bloody Sunday, you know, considering what they've gone through, and they were still remembering us. You know, it's really important that we, sometimes solidarity, it might not have a physical benefit, you might not be able to do anything, but just knowing that someone or some people somewhere else in the world are thinking of your struggle at that time can be really, really important. Like I said, we benefited from that for many years, and if we can continue to do that to other people for instance, in Palestine, yeah, then the museum will continue to do that. We set this up to be a museum about civil rights, not just a museum about our civil rights struggle. So it is the way of the world that there will always be some form of a civil rights or state violence issue that needs to be highlighted. So as well as continuing to tell our own story, the museum can be used to tell a wider and wider range of stories. We've already taken some steps in that direction in terms of civil rights issues, where we curated and hosted the Queer in the North exhibition last year, which was, I think, the first museum standard exhibition on the LGBTQ history of the North since 1967. We've hosted exhibitions in here on British colonialism, on other state violence issues in the North, on issues in various other parts of the world, and we'll continue to do that. It would be an ideal world if we didn't have to exist, but it's not an ideal world, and museums like this, institutions like this, will continue to be relevant as long as there are things that we have to highlight.
On the wall, as you come in or go out, it does say, doesn't it, that I can't remember the exact quotation, but it says something along that all those who struggle for freedom and justice will find a welcome here. And I think that's true. I think all museums, centres that tell the story of human beings struggling to achieve change, to achieve justice, will always resonate with other people internationally. And in that sense, I think it's right to say that people who come here from other countries will not just be interested in the story, but also will be inspired by it, and hopefully when they go back to their own country will be strengthened in terms of the struggles that they're involved in.
Well, obviously the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday will be a huge occasion for the city and for Ireland as a whole. So we are in the midst of planning for that. 30 years ago, for instance, in the run-up to the 20th anniversary, we didn't have a campaign. The families weren't involved in any campaign, so we very consciously targeted the 20th anniversary in that way, so as to get the best out of it. The 50th anniversary, I think, gives us our opportunities in terms of looking at progressive causes within the city of Derry, commemorating obviously the memory of those who were killed in Bloody Sunday will be front and centre of all that we do. But it'll also be done in a way so as to connect up with the young people of the city, minorities within the city, like for instance refugees and our new nationalities to the city, and make them feel as welcome as we should. And then there's a whole series of events that are planned in terms of the music of the city, culture of the city, the literary achievements of the city. We're going to commemorate all those things during the course of 2022. We're particularly keen to work with the Protestant Unionist community as much as we possibly can, and to ensure that the lessons that we have learned over the years are passed on to the younger generations as well. So it'll be a big organisational challenge for the Trust and the museum, but I think we're more than up for the challenge, and I'd be very confident that we will share the anniversary with thousands and thousands of people in the city of Derry, throughout the island and beyond.
Most of the people alive in Derry today were not around during the Free Derry period, so they know no more about Free Derry than, for example, I knew about the Second World War. I mean, I was born just after the Second World War. So clearly the Second World War to me is history, unlike my parents who lived through it. And Free Derry is history for most people who now live in Derry and indeed in Ireland.
I think it's important for them to have a voice and have an understanding of what happened in their community, just so then they realise kind of where they come from, who they are as people, and how that shaped them to be who they are, I suppose. You can be from Derry, but you don't know the story, even from living here, and hearing maybe your mummy and daddy maybe bringing it up once or twice. You'd never truly know until you walk through those doors and you speak to the people that either work in here or eyewitnesses or seeing the artefacts themselves.
It is partisan in terms of it tells a story of the people who rose up against discrimination and the denial of justice. It doesn't give everybody's side of the story, and it doesn't intend to do that. But for people who want to know what happened, why people engaged in the way that they did, what the results of that struggle were, and so on, I think they will come here and find the information that they need. And that's particularly true, as I say, for people in Derry and indeed Ireland as a whole, who were not around at the time, and which is now most of the people in Ireland. I mean, you'd be one of them, so in a sense you'd be better placed to answer the question than me. But I think you take the point I'm making about the degree to which people living in Derry, this is now a historical event of which they don't necessarily have a memory of.
Because it's their story as much as it's the museum story. It's how we were raised. It's in Derry's blood. It's in our own blood. You have to come in here and see it. There's just no two ways about it. Like, it's so important that you learn about your past to understand how you are as a person.